is now my pleasure to welcome Floyd, Director of the Whole of Government Center of Excellence, to the stage for this conversation on defending freedom with allies.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. So to give you a little bit of background while we're waiting for the Department of Defense to come online here with us, the Whole of Government Center of Excellence was an idea that actually came out of the military and interagency with the recommendation to William and Mary to create this epicenter for convening, for research, for education. So it's with that in mind that it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Kahl, who's going to be giving us a small address. Then I'm going to get a few kind of questions in, and then we're going to turn it over to you and those online. Dr. Kahl.
Great. Good morning, everybody from the Pentagon. It's terrific to be with you all. The vibrant, enlightened participation of the world's youth at this year's NATO Youth Summit underlines the indomitable spirit and commitment you all have to shaping a safer, more equitable, and peace-oriented future. Young leaders like you are integral to our collective effort to safeguard the rules-based international order, which really undergirds our safety, our prosperity, and our way of life. You are convening at a time of tremendous change and grave threats to that order, as demonstrated by Russia's brutal war of aggression in Ukraine and Ukraine's valiant defense of the freedoms that many of us take for granted. The perspectives that you share throughout this summit can help shape NATO's future strategy, not only in confronting traditional security threats, but also in key areas such as mitigating the existential threat from climate change, combating disinformation, and responding to accelerating developments in generative artificial intelligence and other emerging and disruptive technologies. The world desperately and urgently needs creative solutions to complex problems like this. And your role in devising and implementing these creative solutions begins with your decision to engage and serve. For my part, when I'm not serving in government, I'm a professor at Stanford University, and I'm constantly inspired by my amazing students. Each encounter with bright young minds like yours serves as a reminder you are light years ahead of where I stood at your age, which I can assure you, having just had a birthday, was a long time ago. You're armed with far greater capabilities than I was, and you have access to powerful tools to make a real difference on the world around you. And I have complete confidence that you will do so. Day to day, what I try to do is do my best to help the United States and our allies and partners contend with daunting issues we collectively face. But I also believe that it's my solemn obligation as a current policymaker to help build a bridge that will enable your journey. I need you. We all need you to succeed. We are counting on you to seize the enormous opportunities and potential inherent in the current age and to help craft enduring solutions to our gravest challenges. So don't let us down. And with that, I look forward to the conversation.
Some baselining for those around the world and in DC, some who might be very familiar with the Department of Defense and its role, and those that might want to have a little bit more background in education here. So can you tell us specifically about your role as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, kind of how that fits into DoD, and then also the ways you've been responsible for crafting the department's national defense strategy? How do these puzzle pieces fit together?
Yeah, who am I? Why am I here? As the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, I think the easiest way to conceptualize my role is that I'm essentially the civilian national security advisor to the Secretary of Defense. So I run an organization of about 800 core staff. And then when you factor in other folks who work for the agencies that report to me, it's about 3,000 people. And our role is to do a couple of things. First, we staff the secretary. For all his meetings, right now he's traveling abroad. He just finished trips to Singapore, to Japan, India. He's now on his way to Normandy, France. My team prepares all those materials. We send subject matter experts along with the secretary to help with those engagements. We help plan those trips, both in terms of process and in terms of substance. When the secretary is back in the building, I am his senior advisor on making recommendations associated with foreign policy, defense policy. I'm also the secretary's representative to what we call the interagency, which is just a fancy term for the various departments and agencies in our government that deal with national security affairs, getting in a room together to hash out big policy issues. So I'm his representative to the Deputies Committee, which is one level down essentially from the cabinet, the principal level. And then another big part of my job is to provide civilian oversight inside the building to our force deployments, to our war plans, and to any decision inside the Department of Defense that impacts foreign and defense policy. And then lastly, my job is to represent the department on the world stage in defense diplomacy by interacting with my counterparts from allies and partners in every corner of the globe. So it's a big job at an important time, and it's been the honor of my lifetime to have this opportunity. One of the things that my organization does is we draft the National Defense Strategy. The National Defense Strategy nests underneath our national security strategy. And I think what's notable about this National Defense Strategy, which came out last year in 2022, is that it clearly identifies the People's Republic of China as what we call our pacing challenge. Both those words are important, pacing and challenge. Pacing because China is the only country with the capability and increasingly the intent to displace the United States as the world's leading power and to replace the rules-based international order that the United States helped give birth to after World War II with some alternative that is closer to the PRC's own interests and values. They not only have that intent, but they have increasingly the technological, diplomatic, military, and economic capability to do so. So that's why they are our pacing challenge. But the word challenge is also intentional in the sense that we don't see conflict with China. We don't think a conflict with China is either imminent or inevitable. But we will defend our interests around the world, not only here in the homeland, but in the broader Indo-Pacific with our allies and partners and globally. And so we will seek to compete with China where we can, cooperate with them where we can, and stand up for our interests consistently. The National Defense Strategy also identifies Russia as an acute threat. And again, both of those terms are intentional, acute and threat. Acute meaning sharp and immediate, and threat meaning threat. And it's clear that Russia is an adversary state. Unlike China, it doesn't have the capability to dominate the world, but Russia does have the ability to blow up the world. And given its aggression in Ukraine and the threat that it poses to the transatlantic community, we have obviously been doing all we can to address that threat by assisting the Ukrainians. And maybe with that, I'll pause and look forward to your other questions.
Sir, speaking of transatlantic unity, in the last 24 years, 14 nations became part of NATO, with Finland being the 15th and Sweden set to join soon. How can the United States help lead in welcoming these nations particularly into the alliance? And how can we do that job demonstrating our commitment to collective security with the new friends in the room?
Yeah, it's a great question and a well-timed one given Finland's entry into NATO and we hope Sweden's in the very near future. Look, the 14 countries that you've mentioned are all different. They come in all shapes and sizes, different capabilities. Some were part of the former Soviet orbit. Some, like Finland and Sweden, have traditionally had a position of neutrality. And so, it's not the same for every country. I will just say that when it comes to Finland and Sweden, you're talking about two countries that already have tremendous capability. They have very robust militaries. They have very impressive defense industrial bases, which I think, as we've seen in the conflict with Ukraine, is hugely important to the alliance. And in both Finland and Sweden, they have incredibly important, favorable strategic geography. Finland alone essentially doubles the land border between NATO and Russia and poses real dilemmas for Russia as it relates to the threat that it may pose for NATO. Sweden is also extraordinarily favorable geography. So, it's not one of these situations where I think the alliance has to do a bunch of things for Finland and Sweden. And right out of the gate, they are going to do a bunch of things to strengthen the NATO alliance. But what we look forward to doing is integrating Finland and Sweden into NATO planning, fully integrating them into NATO exercises, ensuring that their militaries are fully interoperable. That means can operate alongside other NATO allies, and that we're doing everything together as allies. And frankly, I think that'll just be a natural evolution to the already extraordinarily close defense relationship we've had with both Finland and Sweden.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to get one more question in, and then I'm going to encourage you guys to line up at the microphone to get your questions, as well as to put any questions in online that you might like through the WebEx app. So one of the themes of today is that security and defense take many different forms and require that diverse and inclusive community of smart people here in the room and online to advance democratic values. As a scholar of political science, is there a skill or subject from outside that discipline, apologies if I'm throwing you a curveball, that has served you particularly well? I'm thinking maybe that was a class on literature, a pivotal study abroad moment, something in that space where you said, I'm going to be really multidisciplinary in my approach, and it's going to help me advance these democratic goals.
Yeah, it's something I think about a lot, actually. I mean, there are skill sets that I think, regardless of what you study, are extraordinarily important. You have to be a good writer. You have to be an articulate communicator. You have to operate well under stress. You have to be a good team player. You have to be able to staff up and eventually manage down, and you have to do it all with a sense of humanity. You have to be a good person. If you can do all of those things, you will be successful and really maximize your service. In terms of background, yes, I'm a political scientist by training. I am, as I like to joke, I have a doctorate in political science, but I'm neither a real doctor nor a real scientist. And I would say that, frankly, outside of the discipline of political science and international relations that I focused on, I think some of the other social sciences that have proved and humanities type issues that have proven really important are economics, history, psychology. They're all very important. But I would say increasingly, I think science and technology backgrounds are going to be important. So many of the challenges that we face today really cross the streams between kind of the social sciences and the hard sciences. And so, knowing how to code, being an engineer of one kind or another, having a strong math and science background really will enable that next generation of policymakers to weigh in on issues like cybersecurity and artificial intelligence and address issues like global pandemics and climate change, where it's not just kind of a political science or a legal background or an economics background that will be most important, but really being able to bring technical skills to the table when talking about those issues.
Fantastic point you make, sir, and one we take to heart at William & Mary, that bridging of liberal arts with data science, computer science, cybersecurity, and other pieces that are reflected in our Vision 2026. So now may I invite anyone that would like to go ahead and line, oh, there is a queue, sir. All right, I would love to get through as many of these as possible. I might not even get my final question in, so you're going to launch in. Please be brief, and then, sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, sir, for your time. My name is Liam Leslie. The question I had was, can you give us some insight into the department's view about whether it's on tanks or now with fighter jets, how the Department of Defense should work with NATO allies and where it should take the lead in terms of equipping the Ukrainians with more capabilities?
Yeah, it's a great question, and we could probably fill hours with the answer. I'll just say this: the United States has now provided nearly $40 billion of security assistance to Ukraine in about 15 months. That is historically unprecedented. I'm very proud of what we've done to be able to deliver that assistance. The Ukrainians have fought with tremendous courage and bravery and tenacity. But it's the fact that we've been able to deliver this security assistance has really put them in the best position to beat back, the Russians. And I think, it's hard to know where the war is going to go from here, but I think it's already clear that the Russians have essentially lost since their goal was to take over Ukraine, and that's not going to happen. Their goal was to weaken NATO, and the absolute reverse has happened. And their goal was to make Russia stronger and more coercive on the world stage. And Russia's going to emerge from this conflict weaker than it's been in decades. And so, I think that the United States, standing alongside our allies and partners, have done a lot to put Ukraine in the position to survive, to endure as a democratic, sovereign, independent country, but also to inflict a strategic failure on Russia for its active aggression. The allies and partners have been crucial. Next week, the Secretary of Defense will host yet another Ukraine defense contract group. It's his 10th or 11th. It's hard to keep track at this stage. These collections of these meetings bring together about 4 dozen countries from around the world. So it's not just NATO countries, but countries from the Middle East, from the Indo-Pacific, and elsewhere coming together to support Ukraine. And so even though the United States is by far the largest donor of security assistance to Ukraine, tens of billions of dollars of additional equipment and assistance have been provided by our allies and partners. And again, I'm very proud of the role that the United States has played in helping to galvanize and rally the world to really support what Ukraine is doing, just to stand up for the freedoms that all of us cherish.
Thank you, sir.
Concise question and concise answer, sir.
Hi, thank you so much for your time, Dr. Cole. My name is Elijah Tsai. I'm a William & Mary Global Scholar. My question was, at the recent Security Forum in Singapore, Li Shangfu, the Ministry of National Defense of China, said that NATO-like alliances would send Asia into a whirlpool of disputes and conflicts, to which the Secretary of Defense responded that we are not trying to create a new NATO in Asia. How do we balance reassuring allies and bolstering the international rules-based order while also ensuring that we do not signal to China that we are encroaching? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, the Secretary is absolutely right. We're not seeking to create a new NATO, but we do have treaty allies in the Indo-Pacific. You know, Japan, the Philippines, Australia, South Korea, Thailand. And increasingly, there are opportunities for us not only to work bilaterally with our closest treaty allies, but to work in other configurations. So trilaterally, we're doing more and more in response to North Korean provocations with Japan and the ROK in the United States together. There are real opportunities to do things trilaterally with Japan, Australia, and the United States. Outside of our traditional alliances, but an increasingly close partner in India, we have what's called the Quad, which is India, Japan, the United States, and Australia. We have this large submarine deal that involves the UK and Australia called AUKUS, that also has a emerging technology component to it. So really, the Indo-Pacific and Europe are not the same. We're not trying to recreate NATO, but we do have an unparalleled network of allies and partners, and it is in our collective interest to stitch those countries together in various constellations to advance our shared interests. None of that is a threat to China. In fact, the PRC's rise was enabled by the rules-based international order that the United States and our allies and partners helped to promote in that part of the world. There is plenty of room for both of us. We're not looking to encroach on China, but the Indo-Pacific is also not an exclusive sphere of influence for the PRC to lord over. And so we will continue to defend a free and open Indo-Pacific. We'll continue to fly, sail, and operate wherever international law allows. And we would expect that the PRC would respect those rules of the road, which are not American rules. They are international rules.
Sir, you've got a two-finger on line from a student interested in geopolitics. Could you add into the role that the DoD sees for India in curtailing China, especially taking into account their position of neutrality in dealing with Russia?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, India is it's 1/5 of humanity. It's one of the most consequential countries in the world. It's the world's largest democracy. It's an extraordinarily diverse and dynamic society. India has a lot to contribute to the world. I think that historically, India has kind of, pursued a middle path of neutrality among other major powers. I think in recent years, however, India has increasingly seen the PRC as a real strategic challenge to India's security. I think this was augmented, magnified, especially in 2020, with a combination not only of the COVID pandemic, but also the clashes along the shared land border between India and China. So I think India is hoping to do a lot more with the United States on the defense side. The Secretary of Defense was just in India. We'll have Prime Minister Modi visiting the United States for a state visit here in the not too distant future. And there's a lot of opportunity to deepen our defense ties with India. Now, historically, India has had close defense ties with Russia. They use a lot of Russian equipment. They produce, some Russian origin equipment in India. But I think increasingly India would like to diversify away from Russia and not be dependent on Russia. And I think that's in India's self-interest because on the one hand, Russian equipment in a lot of instances isn't that great. We're seeing that on the battlefield in Ukraine. But in other circumstances, I think what the world's democracies have learned is that you don't want to be overly dependent on Vladimir Putin because that's not a recipe for security.
Well, that might end up being one of our taglines out of the NATO Youth Summit, sir. Next question, please.
Hi, sir. Thanks for speaking with us today. My name is Joseph Waymeyer. I have a question regarding the future of defense policy in the Arctic. With the addition of Finland and possibly Sweden into NATO in the near future, I'm curious, what does future defense policy look like in the Arctic as competition for resources is increasing, and obviously there will now be the United States, Canada, Norway, Finland, potentially Sweden against Russia with competition for resources in the region?
Yeah, it's a great question and probably worthy of an extended answer. But since I will be have been instructed to be concise, I'll just say a few things. Climate change is changing everything about the Arctic. It is changing the operational environment. It is opening up new pathways to gain access to resources. And one of the things that's doing is magnifying competition for those resources. And you combine that with the fact that most Arctic nations will be in NATO, and the other one being Russia, and the adversarial relationship between the two, and the fact that the PRC also has ambitions to turn scientific and commercial endeavors in the Arctic into, we believe, military advantage over the long run. And I think we're in for growing competition in the Arctic. That said, I do think the Arctic is a global commons, and it is an area that no one nation owns, and where we still need to carve out space for cooperation on areas like resource management, science, and combating climate change. So even in this more competitive setting, we need to look for avenues where they present themselves to preserve some scope for cooperation.
Thank you.
Hello, sir. My name is Jawan Singh. When discussing the PRC and in terms of a rule-based international order, how should we address violations that China makes without necessarily provoking them or degrading our relationship?
Yeah, I mean, this inherent tension between standing up and not wanting to generate a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think the answer is it's a day-to-day exercise in standing up for what's in our interest, and standing alongside our allies and partners in defending the rules of the road that we all have. So, when we engage in freedom of navigation, whether it's in the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait, we're not doing that to provoke China. We're doing that to reassert a global norm under international law that gives us the permission to fly, sail, and operate wherever international law permits. And these are extraordinarily important waterways for global commerce. So it's not just in America's interest, it's in the world's interest for these not to be seen as exclusive spheres of influence that China can coerce and bully its way and lord over. So we will stand up for our interests and for the rules-based international order. We will do it alongside our allies and partners so the PRC understands that it's not us versus them. But if they're challenging those rules, they are challenging a collection of most of the countries in the world that stand by those principles. By the same token, we need to build guardrails around our relationship so that we don't have incidents or that those incidents don't spiral out of control, which is one of the reasons why we have been encouraging the PRC to open up more and more frequent channels of communication. I think it was unfortunate that the Chinese Minister of Defense chose not to meet with the Secretary of Defense in Shangri-La. They had a passing handshake, but a handshake does not substitute for a substantive meeting between the two heads of the respective defense ministries. And so I would just hope that if China wants to be a great power on the global stage, with great power comes great responsibility, and they need to pick up the phone.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir, for coming to talk to us. Zach Hill, George Washington University. So you had alluded earlier to the importance of the defense industrial base, how the war in Ukraine exposed deep deficits in defense stocks, particularly munitions stocks. What role do you see for U.S.-European defense cooperation to remedy this problem?
Yeah, it's a great question. A couple things. First, it's a legacy of the fact that the United States and other countries in NATO have for a long time overinvested in platforms relative to the munitions that launch off those platforms. I also think for a long time we were focused on conflicts in the context of the so-called global war on terror, not high-intensity conventional war fights like we're seeing in Ukraine. And so, the effort to assist the Ukrainians has put stress on our defense industrial base. It's also put enormous stress on Russia's defense industrial base. So it's not unique. I think we need to do things both unilaterally and collectively. Unilaterally, we're making billions of dollars in additional investments in our defense industrial base and our supply chains to make them more resilient and responsive and to increase overall capacity. We're also working with Congress to get additional authorities to allow us to spend money over a number of years, because sometimes when you're only doing it year after year, it's harder for companies to make the longer term investments that are really necessary to raise the overall level of production. We also need to do things like train and incentivize a workforce. Given, the good news is unemployment is low in the United States. The bad news is it can be hard to get people to work on a factory making artillery shells because of the competition for jobs. But I think increasingly what we're recognizing is that we have to see the defense industrial base as a collective good of the free world. That is, that it's not, I think a lot of times we think of these as just national things. The United States and France are allies, but our companies also compete with one another around the world for arms sales. And I think increasingly among, advanced economies and democracies, we need to see our defense industrial base as something that benefits us collectively, and we need to ensure that that defense industrial base is sufficiently robust, but also interoperable and ideally interchangeable, so that an artillery shell produced in one part of the United States is compatible with a howitzer or an artillery system that is produced in the middle of Europe.
Thank you. Sir, you still have quite a queue. I'm going to ask the next 5 in line to huddle and maybe come up with a collective question or highlight themes. So huddle for a second, and I'm going to give you a quick question here while they do that. What's the biggest piece of advice you'd have for young professionals with an interest in service in government, whether DoD or the State Department?
Do it. I think that honestly, there are a lot of interesting career paths in the world. And public service is not the most remunerative. You can probably make more money doing other things, but you can find few things more rewarding than serving your country or serving an international organization with principles that you agree in, or working for a non-governmental organization domestically or internationally. Serve your community, serve your country, serve your world, because we need people who are not only looking out for themselves, but are really invested in making the world a better place, because there are plenty of people who are not invested in making the world a better place. So we need you. We need you to be energized around the issues that will really determine whether the future is a good one or not. So my advice is do it. And the only other thing I would say is don't presume there's any one path. There may be a path that starts with an internship or an overseas opportunity. Or something, it may be that you want to work in a particular department or agency in the government, but you can't get in. You can't get a job as a foreign service officer. So instead, you take a job working in the intelligence community for a period of time. There are many pathways, executive, legislative, and otherwise, and there's no straight line to success. So do it, and not only have a plan A, but have a plan B, C, D, E, and F to get you there.
Thank you, sir. All right, time's up. Wonderful huddlers. I think you have a 17-part question coming, sir. And this will be the last question, so I'll wrap it when you're done. Go ahead.
First of all, thank you so much for being here. Second, there were many different questions here, and they were all fantastic questions, so I hope you all get a chance to talk after this, because I'm trying to incorporate all of them thematically. But the big question that we came up with is the role of disinformation and other issues in the digital sphere, such as terrorism, the development and regulation of artificial intelligence, and other problems that are transnational in nature and necessarily involve the private sector. For example, disinformation about climate change or state-sponsored threats, such as the Russian Internet Research Agency, which interfered in the 2016 and potentially 2020 election. How can these issues that are transnational, exist in the private sphere, and also overlap with state-sponsored threats be addressed by NATO and the Department of Defense specifically?
Yeah, it's a huge question, and I know just looking over the agenda for your meeting that you're having a lot of discussion on this topic. I'll just say a few things. First, I think the question captures a lot of the challenges that misinformation and disinformation pose. We see powers large and small on the world stage using it for propaganda purposes to justify human rights abuses or acts of aggression. You saw that in the lead up to the war in Ukraine on the Russian side, for example. Obviously, there's a lot of disinformation as it relates to pandemics. That was rampant during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, and it really undermined the ability of societies to have sufficient levels of trust to respond adequately to the pandemic. There's a lot of misinformation about climate change dating back for a long period of time that has slowed our response to what is an existential challenge to the human race. And so getting the facts right on climate change matters a lot. Disinformation, misinformation fuels terrorism and various forms of violent extremism. It is involved in election interference, and something that we've dealt with very close to home here in the United States in recent years is how much misinformation and disinformation, really supercharged by social media, has contributed to the kind of tribalism and polarization in our politics that's made having a civil discourse very difficult. And when you can't have a civil discourse, you can't govern. And when you can't govern, you can't solve problems. So it is one of the root challenges we face in addressing all of the challenges, domestic and foreign, that you all are talking about. And unfortunately, this problem is going to get worse before it gets better, because one of the things that ChatGPT and other large language models and other forms of generative AI are going to produce is the democratization of disinformation that is simultaneously tailored and at scale and operating at machine speed. One of the things that's been said about some of these programs is that they're not built to be truthful, they're built to be persuasive. And one of the things that programs like ChatGPT do is they hallucinate in the sense that they present information that is actually not truthful. But we also hallucinate when we interact with them, because it sometimes can be difficult to distinguish whether I'm interacting with a bot or a human being. And so I think the aperture for disinformation and misinformation is going to expand. So that is incumbent upon all of you to make sure that in the arms race for generative artificial intelligence, whether it's text or deepfake videos or fake images or whatever, that the race is on the side of the programs that identify misinformation and disinformation and flag authentic information for users, so that we don't live in a world where artificial intelligence is making us dumber and turning us against one another, but actually is making us smarter, more productive, and more capable of solving problems.
That is a brilliant and coherent response. Thank you so much.
All right, we'll leave
Thank
it there,
you.
sir.
I will let
Please
my
join
staff
me.
know that you said that, because I've never heard that before.
Final last words. Thank you, sir. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.